Hi, this is Kevin Trainer. Welcome to my lecture on Chapter 6 of the Kathy Schwalbe text, An Introduction to Project Management, 7th edition. Uh, Chapter 6 is about planning projects, Part 3. And there's a lot of content here, so I'm going to break it up into two parts. So this will be Part 1. The learning objectives I'm going to leave for you to read on your own. So the point of this slide is essentially to say all the stuff we're going to talk about in the chapter is important to consider when you're planning a project. Okay, and this includes quality, resources, communication, stakeholders, risk, and procurement. Okay, and if you look at the slide we have here, you can see that this all fits into the scheme, the organization scheme from the PMI PMBOK, Project Management Body of Knowledge. Okay, and you can see what all these knowledge areas are that I just mentioned. uh, what part of the planning process that is part of, right? And what some of the outputs are. And again, I'll lead you to read the details on your own. So let's talk about project quality management. That's pretty important stuff. It ensures that the project will satisfy the stated or implied needs for which it was undertaken. Key outputs produced as part of project quality management include a quality management plan. There's always a plan when we're following the PMI curriculum. Quality metrics and updates to the project management plan and project documents. So I think it's important for us before we go off and start talking about quality to really know just in what sense we're talking about it in terms of project management. So the ISO organization defines quality as the degree to which a set of inherent characteristics fulfill requirements. And some other experts define quality based upon conformance to requirements or fitness for use. Conformance to requirements is means that the project's processes and products meet written specifications, and fitness for use means that a product can be used in the way it was intended. The customer ultimately decides what level of quality is going to be acceptable. So what's the quality management plan? Well, quality planning includes identifying which quality standards are relevant to the project and how best to satisfy those. Okay, we don't want to just kind of generally say that we're going to meet quality standards. We want to say which ones in particular. It also involves designing quality into the products of the project as well as the processes involved in managing the project. Like other plans, the size and complexity of the quality management plans is going to vary depending upon the needs of the project. In particular, how big this project is and how complex it is. So we have here an example of a quality management plan that was created for one of the cases that we've been following in the textbook, the Just-in-Time Training Project. And it includes an introduction, and quality standards. And the standards that they have here are survey standards because it involves a survey, supplier selection standards because it involves selecting suppliers, and training standards because it involves training. It includes metrics. Okay, so um, including the survey response rate and the course evaluations, problem reporting and corrective action processes, supplier quality control. Okay, so what do we mean when we say quality metrics? Well, a metric is the standard of measurement. Metrics allow organizations to measure their performance in certain areas and compare them over time or with other organizations. Examples of common metrics used by organizations include failure rates of the products that they produce, availability of goods and services, and customer satisfaction ratings. The ones that they picked in this just-in-time training project included a time, completing the project within 1 year, customer satisfaction, achieving an average course evaluation of at least 3.0 on a 5.0 scale. Wish I could get away with that. Cost reduction, recouping the cost of the project and reduce training costs within 2 years after the project completion. Many organizations use charts to keep track of their metrics, such as a project dashboard, a graphical screen-like presentation summarizing key metrics for the project. And here we're showing some dashboards. So here's a dashboard created for the just-in-time training project. It's as of a certain day. And it looks like this is the kind of dashboard in which we take these metrics and we categorize them as green on target, yellow slightly off a target, and we're giving a caution, or red, it's off a target and it's a problem area. Here's another example of a project dashboard. In this case, this came from projectmanager.com. Okay, and here's some more detail from a quality management plan. So we're talking about just how we're going to measure the survey response rate and how we're going to act on the measurements that we get, and the same kind of thing for course evaluations. Another area that is important for us to include in our plans is project resource management. And primarily when we're talking about resources in projects, particularly software development projects, which a lot of the people who take my courses, these are the kind of projects that we're thinking about. They're mostly human resources, okay? So people. Now, the Agile people like to make fun of the waterfall people for referring to people as resources. And in their defense, they're trying to be kind of like engineers and scientists. Okay, so they're trying to use terms that are precise. um, this is a place where I think they missed the mark. And they are interested in other resources as well. So, again, even software development projects consume other resources other than human resources. They consume computing time, and they consume office space, and they consume airline tickets and hotel rooms and all those kinds of things. So um, it's always fun to laugh with the Agile folks when they make fun of the terms used by the more traditional folks. But I think that you have to allow the more traditional folks credit for trying to be comprehensive and trying to be, kind of engineer, scientist kind of people. Okay. Um, a lot of people say that people are the most important thing in their business. Whether they act like that or not, I'm not sure, but they definitely say it. And project resource management, as understood as part of the PMI curriculum, is concerned with making effective use of the people involved with the project as well as the physical resources, materials, facilities, equipment, infrastructure. The main outputs produced as part of a project resource management plan are the project resource management plan and a team charter. And we'll talk about the team charter idea in a minute. Uh, so, what might be in a team management plan? Well, there's some good stuff here. And again, uh, most most of the most of the items that I'm covering in the beginning of this lecture have come from traditional project management, what some would call waterfall project management. Um, that isn't to say that these things might not help somebody who's trying to manage um, an agile project, either creating these kinds of charts or matrices or um, analyses, or certainly the kind of thinking that goes into them, okay, could easily be applied to an agile project, even though the agile people don't talk about this kind of stuff very often, okay? And the kind of things that we have here is a project organizational chart, responsibility assignments, matrix, a resource histogram, and a staffing management plan. Um, so project organizational charts are just what you think they are. Okay, they are hierarchical charts that show how the project's organized with respect to people and who reports to whom. Okay. Responsibility assignment matrices. Let's see if we can go ahead and see one. Okay, it's going to be a table that's going to look like this. Okay, so why don't we back up and then we'll talk about it. So a responsibility assignment matrix, or a RAM, is a matrix that maps the work of the project as described in the work breakdown structure to the people responsible for performing the work. For smaller projects, it's best to assign the WBS activities to individuals. Now, I just want to point out that a couple of chapters ago, we claimed that uh, activities weren't part of a proper WBS. Okay, only deliverables were, and that the careful way of thinking about a WBS, it's organized by a deliverable, and that when we do scheduling, we identify activities and we organize them using the WBS. But that's not what this slide implies. So I'm just going to point that out. So um, in smaller projects, so what are we going to assign responsibility for? We're going to assign responsibility for activities. These are things that are in the schedule. Okay. And we're saying that in smaller projects, we probably would want to assign that responsibility to individual people, and maybe larger products to organizational units or teams, because we're not sure what individual person might be taken responsible for that. There's a kind of chart like this called a Racky chart, um, that shows who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who gets informed. So that's RACI, RACI. Okay, and that, I think what's really interesting there is um, it's taking the fine shades of interest for interested parties and trying to distill out how they're interested. Okay, so these are a list of kind of tests, I guess. Yeah, and here are people, and now we're saying of this RACI, uh, for each individual, what how are they involved with that task? Okay. And so, for instance, for stakeholder communications for uh, Kristen is both responsible and accountable. And if we go back and we look at responsible, who does the task, accountable, who signs off on the task or has the authority for it. So again, it gives you the opportunity to distinguish, fine shades of interest. Another another artifact of the planning process that can be really useful is a resource histogram. Uh, Often you'll see this in terms, well, you'll see this used for resources that are scarce. Okay. That's typically people. But it doesn't have to be people. It could be conference rooms. It could be uh, machines. It could be whatever, right? So a resource histogram is a column chart that shows the number of resources required or assigned to the project over time, in planning project staffing needs and other resource provision plans. Senior managers often create a resource histogram in which columns represent the number of people needed in each skill category. By stacking the columns, you see the total number of people needed each month. So we have an example on the following slide, and this is probably a large project approach. If you think about what we're doing when we're doing the equivalent people analysis in an agile sort of project, well, we have an agile project team. We're expecting all the people to get involved in most all of the work in some way or other. We're not trying to differentiate between skill levels and categories. We're trying to emphasize collaboration. Okay. Here we're talking about a larger group of people, maybe with the work organized a little bit more hierarchically within the team. And we just want to make sure we get the right level of staffing in each of the time periods. Uh, so this could lead to a staffing management plan. It describes when and how people will be added to and removed from a project. It describes the types of people needed to work on the project, the numbers needed for each type of person each month, and how the resources will be acquired, trained, rewarded, and reassigned after the project. And at, at various times in my career, people have been in short supply or not in short supply. Um, in technology projects, somehow they always seem to be in short supply in terms of who's available to you right now. Um, but as a project manager, you want to be sure that there's a plan that the organization that you're working for has agreed to, that they're going to give you the people when you need to get them. And also that they'll take them back when you're done with them. Okay? Because if they don't, then they're going to keep charging them to your project until whenever they find some other use for them. So here's a staffing management plan for the just-in-time training project. And we're talking about, in some cases, individual people. So Kristen was assigned three-fourths time. In other cases, we're talking about kind of numbers of people. Um, we're talking about staff assignments and issues like training, rewards, and reassignment. And again, I'll leave you to read the details on your own. Um, Now we're going to talk about a document that in current PMI terms is called a team charter, and it was previously called a team contract. And it's an interesting idea. I can't say that everybody does it, but it seems like a great idea. I don't think I've ever done it for one of my projects. I've talked to people who have. Um, so the idea is you create a document um, to help to promote teamwork and to clarify team communications. After core project team members have been selected, they meet to prepare a team charter to guide how the team will function. So they meet together. The idea is that there'll be buy-in for this. All right. It's crucial to emphasize the importance of the project team throughout the project's life cycle, and the team charter should be updated as needed. So here's an example. What did they put in here? Code of conduct and values. Again, I think this is from the sample project. How we're going to manage participation and how we're going to manage communication. Okay, and in this, again, does everybody do this? No. Do some? Yeah, they do. Uh, I've talked to people who did and who thought it was a valuable thing to do. Estimating activity resources. Um, so, um, when we are scheduling a project, the um, the classical kind of traditional waterfall way, um, first we need to identify the tasks or the activities. Then we need to identify their duration. Okay, and then in a as related piece of information, we need to know what resources that they're going to take up. And a lot of times that affects the duration. It's kind of a pairing, right? And you can kind of see this with people. If we were going to be, say, painting a house, okay, we might say, well, if we're going to have one painter, it's going to take 2 weeks. If we're going to have two painters, it's going to take 1 week. Okay, and the same kind of thing with how many machines we're going to put on some kind of a job. If we only have one of the machines and we're using it for a lot of our work, it might take 4 weeks. And if we're going to have two, it's going to take two. So, um, the estimating the resources is identified as a separate task in this kind of traditional PMI approach. But I think it's important to see how the resources and the duration are kind of locked in together. And if you change one, implicitly, you're going to need to change the other. And a lot of the planning tools, even fairly inexpensive one like Microsoft project, when you change the staffing on a task, you can set the defaults as to what you'd like the product to do. But for instance, you can set the defaults such that if you have two people working on a task that takes 1 week and then you take a person off, that it'll change the duration to 2 weeks. Okay. Um, this slide is kind of interesting in that I think this is the point. It's important to understand when things are complicated when you're doing this kind of resource identification and estimating. Um, are there activities that can only be done by certain individual people, right? Uh, Also, are there limits to the number of people or machines or rooms or whatever that uh, you need to stay within, right? So it can be challenging. Uh, so here we have a way to document activity resource requirements, survey administration, internal staffing, hardware and software from the IT department. Again, this would be a way to document what your expectations were uh, as the person who was putting together the plan. Again, it's often helpful to document the assumptions that you've used to create the plan. And here's a good instance of a way that you might do that. Another idea that's been hanging around this kind of thinking for a while is to take the same kind of approach that we took to breaking down the work in a hierarchical organization that we called a work breakdown structure. And people took the same kind of hierarchical breakdown and they applied it to resources, and they call this a resource breakdown structure. So here we've got internal personnel, equipment, supplies, external personnel. One of the things that I like about this is that it's very easy for things to slip through the cracks and for people to forget in planning things that they should expect. And that includes uh, having a source to get those things or those people from, having the budget to pay for those things, right? And having a schedule that accommodates the activity that it's going to take to get them. So this is as good as any other idea to do it. Again, have I used this myself? I probably haven't created one of these diagrams for myself. I have talked to other people who have created them and found them useful. And you have to decide for yourself whether this is going to be part of your project planning. Another important area and one of the knowledge areas from uh, the PMBOK is project communications management. And a couple of points here at the outset to say communication is really important stuff. If communication breaks down on your project is going to fail. Some project managers say that communication is 90% of their job. That seems high, but for instance, my wife is a project manager, and I think a really effective one. And because we both work from home on your average day, and she works upstairs and I work down, I, I get to hear what's going on in her office every time I go up to get a cup of tea or something like that. And I know that she's on the phone in meetings on Zoom a very high proportion of the day. So is it 90%? Well, no, I don't think it's quite that high, but it's pretty darn high. Um, so we need to have a plan for all the parts of communications that our team's going to be doing. And one thing we might want to think about is having a project website. And I don't know why we put this cartoon about code quality here, but I'll leave that for you to enjoy. Um, uh, Communication management plans. Every project should include a communications management plan to document the guides project communications. The plan will vary with the needs of the project, but some type of written plan should always be prepared and address the following items: stakeholder communications requirements, information to be communicated, identification of who's going to receive it, who's going to produce it, uh, method or guidelines for conveying the information, description of the and frequency of the communication, escalation procedures for resolving issues, revision procedures for updating the plan, a glossary if we're using uncommon terms. Okay? Now, these things are not hard to produce because you can create one by copying and modifying a previous one. Okay, and I've made these. I've seen them from lots of projects. Uh, because they set expectations among the parties, I think they're particularly good for the amount of effort that it takes to do this kind of thinking and to document it. I think it definitely more than pays for itself in helping to manage expectations. Here's a sample communications management plan from the just-in-time training project, and I'm going to leave you to read that on your own. Project websites. Now, it's sort of funny. Project websites were not always a part of this. So if you go back, um, I'm trying to think of how long I've been doing this. I think I've had this PMI certification since uh, 2005. A long time, right? And I don't think we talked about project websites then. Okay, so when we began to talk about project websites, it was a really cool idea. Okay, project people's expectations for how we manage data and share it. Having some kind of a website to share the information about your project is so kind of baked into people's ideas now that uh, it almost seems like you don't even have to talk about it. But we're not only talking about websites per se, uh, we're talking about things like, again, a website that we would create with some kind of a web framework, or we could be we could be using a tool like Microsoft SharePoint, or we could be using a tool like Microsoft Teams, or we could be using like any one of a whole. We could be using wikis. We could be using, in fact, um, at the iSchool at Illinois for many, many years, every project team had a wiki. Okay, now I'm thinking we're probably have moved people over to SharePoint or Teams or both, but wikis were big for this. And really, any kind of content management system will do the trick. Okay, so here's a sample project website. I'll leave you to look at that. And that brings us to the general issue of stakeholder management. Stakeholder management is, I think, a really important issue. It's one that you ought to do some like extra thinking about because, generally speaking, things go wrong when we include too many people in the stakeholder group. Okay, because we can't get a consensus, right? Uh, or when we include too few. That might mean that we'll get a quick consensus in the short run, but the other people will show up sooner and later, and then we're going to have to get a consensus with them uh, in order to move forward, and that's going to be made more difficult by the fact that they're angry that we left them out. Okay, and this kind of has to do with another consideration. These things are all interconnected. Um, the scope. Okay, a lot of times when we think of the scope, we think of the scope in terms of um, the features that we're going to address or the non-functional requirements that we're going to support. But when we're talking about projects that are information systems, but the other thing is, yeah, the scope of this problem solution or opportunity that we're capitalizing on for whom, right? And the general question is kind of if you make the scope or the shareholder group too small, you might be successful and have a trivial accomplishment. Okay. So you kind of want to expand them in order to have a more significant accomplishment. But it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and at a certain point, it gets too big to the point where, in terms of stakeholder management, you can't get consensus. So this is at least as tricky as managing the scope. It's kind of the people dimension of scope. So project stakeholder management planning involves determining strategies to effectively engage stakeholders in project decisions and activities based on their needs, interests, and potential impact. The main process is the stakeholder engagement plan. The stakeholder engagement plan, the communications management plan, the resource management plan are tightly bound and should be in agreement. Well, it's probably true of all your plans that they're fairly tightly bound and they should be in agreement. Um, so, what are the contents of a stakeholder engagement plan? Current and desired engagement levels of key stakeholders. Um, we may have some people who we desire to become engaged with the project who don't even know about the project yet. Scope and impact of change to stakeholders. Okay, what kind of how much impact this is going to have on this particular person or group, and have identified interrelationships between stakeholders and potential overlap, potential management strategies for each stakeholder classification, methods for updating the stakeholder management plan. So this document, which we're going to see on the next slide, um, it is a kind of a management plan for influencing people. And as such, it needs to be confidential. One might even say you don't even have to write it down. You need to be able to articulate it, but do you need a written plan? Let's see. So this is the typical thing that you see where you have a table and you have the people as the rows, and we say what's their power and interest and what's their current level of engagement, supporting, supportive, leading, resistant, and then we come up with a plan to get them to where we need to be. Okay, well, people don't want to be managed. Okay, so you don't want stuff like this hanging around, but you definitely want to do this kind of thinking. Okay, so it's a worthwhile activity. Project risk management is a big deal. Okay, things go wrong all the time. Okay, so this PMI knowledge area, risk management, is, I think, a place where a project manager can add a lot of value. So, PMI, in their wisdom, define a project risk as an uncertainty that can have a negative or positive effect on meeting project objectives. Note that some people only view risks as negative and call positive risks opportunities. So, in a scientific sense, risk is variability. Okay, it's variability of potential outcome. And in the PMI way of speaking about this, and this is a well followed way of thinking and speaking about project risk. We talk about negative risks and positive risks. The main planning processes are planning risk management, identifying risks, performing qualitative risk analysis, performing quantitative risk analysis, and planning risk responses. Planning risk responses is a big thing because a lot of times when the risk actually comes to pass, when the event actually happens, we don't always have the time or the clear headedness to plan a good response. It's good to have one already in the can. You can also plan to reduce procurement related risks by making risk related contract decisions. So, a risk management plan documents procedures for managing risks throughout the life of a project. The general topics that a risk management plan should address include the methodology for risk management, roles and responsibilities, budget and schedule estimates for risk related activities, risk categories, probability and impact matrices, and risk documentation. Um, we also, there are kind of standard ways to talk about uh, plans and reserves as they relate to risk. So here are some terms. Contingency plans are predefined actions that the project team will take if an identified risk event occurs. Okay, and this, you often don't have the time to think about these things. Um, you have to have the plan, and we're saying, you know, we're activating plan orange. Okay, and then you do it. A fallback plan uh, is fallback plans are developed for risks that have a high impact on meeting project objectives and are put into effect if attempts to reduce the risk are not effective, sometimes called contingency plans of last resort. So we might have more than one contingency plan. We might have plan orange, and if that doesn't work, we might have plan red. That's a fallback plan. Contingency reserves or contingency allowances are funds held by the project sponsor that can be used to mitigate a cost or schedule overruns if known risks occur. Okay, so when people are doing the financial planning for a project, they shouldn't just assume that everything is going to go down the happy day scenario. Okay, whoever is ultimately financially responsible for the project has to plan in some stuff going wrong. Management reserves are funds held for unknown risks that are used for management control purposes, not part of the cost baseline, but are part of the project budget and funding requirements. Okay, so the distinctions between contingency reserves, project sponsor, that's a high level decision. Management reserves, these are things that the project manager and other stakeholders would be involved in the decisions upon and the controlling of. So here's a sample risk management plan. Okay, so what did they have? Methodology, roles and responsibility, funding and timing, risk categories, risk probability and impact, stakeholder risk appetite, risk documentation. One interesting thing here is this stakeholder risk appetite. Not all organizations have the same appetite for risk. Um, by contrast, I mean, I've done some projects for financial companies that have, say, mutual funds or insurance or stuff like that, and they don't like a lot of risk. They'll take some. Uh, I've done some projects for state and local government. They're really risk averse. They have no appetite for risk at all. Okay, so one of the things that you want to be sure of as a project manager, when as your project is coming up with an assessment of the risk and what your plans are, you have to make sure that the plans are consistent with the risk appetite of the organization as a whole and not maybe some lone player who is not really in tune with the rest of the organization. Uh, when push comes to shove, the organization is going to close ranks and they're going to judge the project by the prevailing risk appetite for that organization or for that industry. Identifying the risks. So you can't manage the risks until you identify them. Identifying the risks involves determining which risks are likely to affect a project and documenting the characteristics of each. This is a perfect thing for a brainstorming activity. The main outputs of this are a risk register and a risk report. Um, so we talk about risk events. So this refers to specific uncertain events that may occur to the detriment or enhancement of the project. Okay, so we have a risk plan. We've identified the risks, and the risk plan just kind of sits there until some event occurs, and then we snap into action. Okay, so we might have negative risk events, or we might have positive risk events. Remember that risk in this sense is just uncertainty. It's not always negative uncertainty. So negative risk events include the performance failure of a product produced as part of a project, delays in completing the work as scheduled, increases in estimated costs, supply shortages, litigation against the company and strikes. Positive risk events could include completing the work sooner than planned, unexpectedly reduced costs, collaborating with suppliers to produce better products, and obtaining particularly good publicity from the project. Um, we also talk about overall project risk. So, overall project risk is the effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole. Contexts of a risk report include sources of overall project risk and summary information on risk events, such as the number of risks, distribution across risk categories, metrics, and trends. The risk report is developed progressively during the entire risk planning process. Here we have, the Schwalbe books always have the section, what went wrong. And let's see, we have examples here of two music festivals that had their own problems. One being the Fire Festival, which I don't think really ever happened. And then we're talking about the Woodstock Music Festival, uh, which to some people was a disaster, but to others of us, including me, may have been one of the great cultural events of our time. So, one person's disaster is a major cultural achievement to someone else. Performing qualitative risk analysis, the PMI approach to this includes both qualitative and quantitative risk analysis, and um, uh, sometimes I just want to point out even the stuff that they call qualitative uh, leads to graphs. Okay, so a lot of people, as soon as they see a graph, they go, well, that's going to be quantitative. Okay. Um, these things are qualitative in which they require the analyst to make kind of value judgments about things, and that's qualitative. All right. So, a probability impact matrix is a good technique. So, that's a qualitative one. So, let's look at this. So these are very popular, and it's a great way to think about this and communicate with your stakeholders. You take all your risks, which you've identified. We haven't seen a risk register yet, but it's essentially a spreadsheet with the risks identified. We'll see one in a slide or two. And on the y-axis, we have the probability that the risk event is going to occur, low, medium, or high. And you just have to rank it. That's the qualitative or interpretive kind of nature of this. And then how big is the impact going to be on the project, low, medium, or high? And you wind up with nine uh, 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 matrices. Um, and thinking on this, if you have a high impact risk that has a high probability of occurring, you're going to want to put a lot of your energy into this. And this is probably why these are risks 1 and 2. They probably have come to the top of the risk register. Uh, by contrast, if you have a low impact risk that has a low probability of occurring, well, you might just want to keep your eye out. I mean, it's on your list of risks, so it must be worth your attention, but certainly nowhere near the attention that you're going to put into things up in this uh, grouping, right? Okay, so even though there was a graph there, that was qualitative. Okay, now we're going to talk about quantitative. So, large complex projects involving leading edge technologies often require extensive quantitative risk analysis. Data gathering often involves interviewing experts and collecting probability distribution information. Quantitative risk analysis and modeling techniques include decision tree analysis, uh, it, digital simulation, influence diagrams, and sensitivity analysis. The most commonly used digital simulation tool is Monte Carlo analysis, and we talk about that in the textbook. Another thing we have to talk about is planning risk responses. Okay, so you have to uh, it's very interesting to think of, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do if the risk event happens? Okay, so the language that we apply to these is a little different based upon if we see this as a negative risk or a positive one. But for the negatives, uh, escalation of the risk, risk avoidance, risk acceptance, risk transference, risk mitigation. Now, um, escalation of the risk is maybe a bad idea for negative risks because we definitely want to be tamping the risk down. Okay. Uh, Positive risk response is escalation of the risk. Well, we definitely want to be able to do that because uh, we want to double down on positive things, right? Uh, risk exploitation. I'm sorry. Risk exploitation is the doubling down. Uh, Escalation of the. Sometimes these phrases are so general. So escalation of the risk would be in terms of escalating our response to it organizationally. Getting people higher up the chain involved in it. Whereas risk exploitation, this is a point I was trying to make earlier and sort of fired off early. Risk exploitation is saying, Well, let's double down. If we have a risk that something good is going to happen, how can we make that happen twice as much? Risk sharing. Okay. This is the kind of thing where will uh, if we if there's a possibly good outcome, and that good outcome has to do with the performance of a partner, why don't we share the rewards that we might get by that risk coming to happen? And then we're more likely to get the result because we're sharing the rewards. Uh, Risk enhancement, that's kind of doubling down as well. And risk acceptance is, well, there's nothing we can do. We're just going to accept it. Okay. So there's certainly a better discussion of this in the textbook, but um, some careful thinking about these things goes a long way. Um, let's see. This slide has to do with, this is another one of those things Kathy Schwalbe likes to do. This talks about the cargo ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal and held up traffic for a long time. Um, and also some problems they had in the Suez Canal and other situations. So they're interesting stories, nothing that I want to discuss further here. And we've got some video highlights related to risk that I invite you to partake in. Risk registers. Okay, this might be a nice place to break between part one and part two. Okay, I think we're more than halfway done, but I'm going to stop here, and I'll be back starting here in part two. Here we go.